Hey guys, welcome back. So today we're working on this Husqvarna 235 chainsaw. This one was dropped off by my friend Jason, who rescued it from the trash. So I don't know the history on this machine. I don't know why it was thrown away. But what I can tell you is that these saws, brand new, were not a lot of money. They were less than $200. So if I had to guess, this machine just stopped running and the owner did not want to pay to have it fixed. So I'm hoping it's going to be an easy fix. Anyway, I had not planned on fixing this right now. I was going to wait till the spring, but a friend reached out and asked if I had a saw for him. And the answer is yes. I actually have 5 saws, but none of them working. All of them are condition unknown. So I pulled this one off the shelf because it seemed to be in the best condition. And it's also kind of an entry-level saw. He is not very experienced, so if this is a viable machine, I think it would be perfect for him. So let me get you set up a little bit better and get going on this. So I'm thinking before we dig into this too deep, I want to make sure we do have a viable machine here. So I'm going to get the cover off. I do want to do a compression test to make sure the compression's good. And then I'm going to get the exhaust pulled off so I can take a look at the piston and cylinder and just make sure that this machine was not straight gassed. Yeah, it looks like someone was trying to get this to run because the plug looks to be brand new, and so does the air filter. So potentially, someone also threw a new carb in there. I guess we will find out in a bit. The rest of the machine, though, it does show a lot of use. So, yeah, I would say these parts are fairly recent. Anyway, let's get the compression tester in there, and hopefully we see some good numbers. All right, let's see what the compression is here. Ideally, it should be at least 120 psi. The more, the better. And yeah, we have tons of compression. It looks like we're at 180 psi, so that should run the engine pretty well. So we have compression, but since we're here, let's just make sure that we have spark. All right, keep an eye out right here. We should see the spark jump this 1/4 inch gap if spark is working. And yeah, spark, not an issue. So we've got compression, we've got spark. All we need is fuel and timing. Everything is checking out well. So I'm thinking, let's just take a look at the piston real quick. If that looks good, then, I say we do the easy thing. We'll add some fresh fuel, pull it over, and see if this thing shows any signs of life. Spark arrestor looks pretty clean. Yeah, the skirt on the piston looks pretty good. Don't see any excessive wear. And right there you can kind of get a glimpse of the far side of the cylinder. And that also looks good. So yeah, I see no concerns here. So I'm going to get the exhaust back on. We'll throw some fuel in. And we'll try to start it. There is fuel in there, so I'm going to drain that out, put some fresh stuff in. It's good to see. We have some two-stroke fuel, little bit of debris, and the fuel actually smells good, so it hasn't been in there for a long time. So let's just make sure the fuel filter's attached before we put new fuel in the tank. And look at that. The fuel filter, it's not attached to the fuel line. So like that, I guess it would have caused a couple problems. First, junk could have been sucked into the carb. But more importantly, that filter, it's not just a filter, it's a weight. So it keeps the fuel line weighted down so that it's actually down in the fuel. And without that attached, likely the carb was not able to draw fuel from the tank. So that likely is why this ended up in the trash. So let me fish that out. We'll try to find the fuel line and reattach it. And I'm willing to bet this saw will run. I actually don't see the fuel line in there. So, yeah, maybe it broke off. It's kind of odd, though, that the piece isn't in there. But I'm not the first one to work on this machine, so I think what we're going to have to do is get to the carburetor where the fuel lines are, and we're going to have to run a new fuel line into the tank. So I've not taken one of these apart before, but we do need to get to the carburetor and likely just pull it off to gain access to where the fuel lines are. So I'm going to start with the kill switch, which is attached to the airbox. So we'll get that out of the way, maybe. There we go. And then we have a screw right there holding the air filter on. And once that's off, I'm expecting we're going to see a couple more bolts which sandwich this airbox and the carburetor to the engine. I can see why someone didn't want to fix this. You can't actually remove the airbox the way that it is now. It would actually seem like you'd have to take the engine out to access the bolts that are way down there, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But I can't say I'm not surprised. So in order to get the saw out the actual engine out, we're going to have to pull a lot of stuff off. So let me just look around, make sure I'm not missing something, but I'm pretty sure there's no other way to get the access we need. Actually, I don't think it's going to be as bad as I initially thought. You know, this piece of plastic here, there is a seam right there, so I think this piece is removable. The only thing in the way is the handle. So I think all I need to do is remove a couple bolts, and this handle should slide out of the way. It looks like we got one more potentially right there and another one up there. Okay, and we are in, and the carb is free. So I think this is the line in question. Looks like it's right near the fuel cap, so potentially I just missed it. Nope, it is broken. So let me see if I have any of the right size to replace this with. So I did find a line that appears to be the correct size. So I'm going to cut this at an angle. That's going to help get it started into the tank, and then we need to grab it and pull it through. I'm not sure how long the original line was, but I'm thinking if we cut it right about there, that should do it. These lines on the primer, they're pretty loose fitting. So I'll cut them back a little bit. And hopefully they'll stay on there a little bit better. Yeah, that's a lot better. All right, place your bets. Is it going to run? It should. The Purge bulb just filled up with fuel. Assuming the carburetor is capable, I think it's going to fire right up. So the choke is on. Let's give it a few pulls. Yep. Okay. The carb does have issues, but it's trying. Let's try it a little more. Yeah, carb has issues, but the saw, it's alive. Okay, good. It started, and actually started pretty easily. You know, it was idling fairly well, but I could not rev the engine up. It would just not rev out. You know, it would fall on its face. So it kind of sounded like it was running lean to me. And the fact that I didn't see any smoke from the exhaust tells me that we are definitely running lean. You know, 2 strokes should emit a certain amount of smoke if jetted properly. So likely the carburetor is to blame, so potentially that needs to be rebuilt or just replaced. But I'm thinking before we do that, you know, we know the prior owner, before throwing this away, was chasing the issue. There's a new plug, a new filter, and potentially he moved the needles. And that might be the issue here. So I'm thinking before we dig into that carb, you know, let's try starting it again. And I want to see if I can fine tune the needles and get this engine running right. And even before I do that, let's turn them in and just see where they're set right now. So we'll start with the low speed needle. We'll just turn it in a 1/4 turn at a time. So there's half, 1, yeah, just over 1.5, which actually isn't a bad starting point. So I'm going to set it back to 1.5 turns out. And let's check the high speed. There's half, just over half. So yeah, that I would say isn't enough. And we know it's not enough, at least based on how it just ran. So let's turn it out back to 1/2. And then another 1/4, maybe another 1/2. So now we're 1.5 on the low, 1 turn on the high. And I'm going to bring the idle up as well. So let me turn that in a bit. Okay, let's try that. And this time around, pretty big difference. After making some adjustments to the needles, I was able to get the saw idling nice at about 3,000 RPM, and now it'll rev out fully, maxing out at about 11,000 RPM. So I'm gonna have to look up the specs on the saw to see what its max speed is. I wanna make sure we're not exceeding it. But aside from that, I think this saw is a survivor and definitely not trash. So far, the only investment in it is my time and a little piece of fuel line. So, with that, we now have a machine that appears to be in good shape. So before moving on, I am curious where we ended up with those needles. So I'm going to turn them both in again. We'll count the turns and just see where the saw ended up at. So we'll check the low speed first. We were just over 1.5 turns last time. So there's half, 1, 1.5, 1 3/4. Yeah, just a bit past 1 3/4. So a little bit more open on the low speed. And the high speed, we were at about half a turn. And that's where we ended up. So it's interesting. The low speed was a little bit lean, so we opened it up, and the high speed is in the same spot. And it's a pretty drastic change in the way the saw runs. So, I'm wondering if there wasn't something preventing it from running right besides the needles. Either way, I think we're looking pretty good. Likely we are going to have to tune this a bit more once the engine is fully warm. But for now, I say we move on. Well, it's been a couple weeks since that last video clip. I ended up taking time off due to Christmas and then unexpectedly got the flu. So I've been out of commission for a bit, but I am vertical again and think I'm feeling pretty well. And I'm hoping to get the saw in the same condition. So, while I was sick, I did order a few parts. And to be honest, I wasn't really paying a lot of attention when ordering these parts. I was not feeling well. So there's a slight chance that these parts may not fit the saw. We will find out in a minute. But I know my friend did want a new bar and chain, so we got a new set of those ordered up. And I also ordered a duck bill valve. This is a check valve for the tank vent. And I ordered that because I noticed when I tip the saw on its side, it leaks a lot of fuel. So I am making an assumption that that is the problem. Unfortunately, to know for sure, we're going to have to strip it down again, get the carb off, and see exactly where that fuel is coming from. But before I do any of that, the thing that really hasn't sat well with me the last 2 weeks is the fact that this saw ran pretty poorly the first time, and then it ran great the second time. And both times we found the high-speed needle was only half a turn out. So over the last 2 weeks, I have made several attempts to find the initial settings as well as the top speed rating on the saw, and I haven't been able to find it. I did also reach out to a few other small engine guys, a few of them that specialize in two-stroke, and they couldn't find the information either, at least not for a 275E. 275 could be found, but that is actually a different saw. And one of the people I reached out to was actually a Husqvarna dealer, and he didn't have access to that service data either. That said, though, I did find one site that said the initial setting on the low speed is 2.5, and right now we're pretty close to 2. And the same site said 2.25 on the high speed, and if that's true, then we are way off. So what I want to do now, since this has been sitting for about 2 weeks, is let's start it back up. Let's see how the engine sounds, and if we need to, we'll make some adjustments before proceeding. So yeah, half a turn out, that was not enough. It was running too lean for sure. So I tried a bunch of different settings. I found that we maxed out at 2.5 turns. The saw was clearly flooding out at that point. So I backed it up, I think about half a turn. So I think we are close to 2 turns out right now. But let's just double check that. There's half, 1, 1.5, 2. And yeah, just a touch over. It's about 2 1/8 turns out. So that, I think, is where I'm going to leave it for now. You know, we'll still have to fine tune it, I think, once we start cutting. But I feel a lot better about that, given that it's pretty close actually to what that website recommended. Now, you know, until we get this in wood, we're not going to know for sure. But at this setting, it is 2-stroking. You know, at lower settings, it was also 2-stroking, but it was kind of cleaning up a little bit too soon, at least in my opinion. But that's without a load on it. So once we start cutting with it, we'll know if it's too much fuel or too little fuel, and we can go from there. But I think that is a much better starting point. So yeah, let's move on. Let's get the old bar and chain off. We will clean everything up, get it back together, and then find the source of that fuel leak. I am a little bit surprised to see there is some surface rust on the clutch. Thankfully, it works fine. Needle bearing also feels good. Now, one bit of maintenance that you should do when you're in here is actually pull the clutch and put a little bit of grease on that needle bearing. You know, I do have a clutch puller, but I just double checked and it's not going to fit this saw. So ideally, this should be done. You know, in my case, I don't want to cause a problem when there's not. You know, this is something that we can revisit in the future. But for now, let's clean up some of this sawdust. We'll get the new bar and chain on, and then we'll track down that final issue. New bar? Yeah, looks like a good fit. So with the bar and chain all set, that just leaves the fuel leak. And before digging in, I want to show you what I was seeing. You know, saws should not leak fuel when on their side. And it would seem like we're good. There's nothing gushing out. But when I went to go refuel it, when this cap was open, I noticed a big leak. So right now it's just kind of loose on there. And if I lift it up now and we give it a second, fuel just starts gushing out. So yeah, that is not normal. We do need to fix that. So I'm going to pause it right here. You've already seen how to get access to the carb. And once we're in, I'll start recording again and we'll find out where that fuel is coming from. All right, we are in. And the area I'm suspicious of is right down here. So the line you see, that is the fuel return, which actually, is that broken too? Yeah, look at that. It is cracked and falling apart. So yeah, it's a good thing I got new fuel lines. I would be surprised though, actually, if that was the source of the leak. I think the issue is down right there because that line is essentially a plug. So it's probably not the tank vent. It's the fact that the line was actually broken. And with the cap on, it was creating a vacuum. But once you open that cap up, you know, the contents of the tank, they are allowed to come out. So there's really no point in tipping it and seeing where the fuel is coming from because it's absolutely going to come from that area where the fuel line should be going to the purge bulb. So yeah, let's just spend a second. I'm going to get all the OEM lines installed and then we'll do the same tip test and see if the tank vent, which is right there, that little dot kind of right there, if that is leaking. But based on what we just found, I'm thinking that likely is actually fine. So let's get the carb out of the way. I'm not worried about saving any of these lines because they're all junk. Even the one I replaced earlier, you know, the inner diameter is a little bit tighter than it should be. So that is going to be swapped out as well to an OEM line. So right there in the center of your screen, that is the duckbill valve. That is the vent that prevents the tank from building vacuum, but it will hold back pressure and fuel. So initially I was thinking that was broken or missing, but that's not the case. And as we saw, that is not the issue. Now, right next to that, there is another hole that is vacant. That's where the broken fuel line goes. So we'll get the new stuff installed, and then we'll close this back up, and we will be ready for business. So we'll just get it in as far as we can externally. And then we'll try to grab it from the inside and pull it the rest of the way. That should do it. And as far as the new fuel pickup, it already comes cut at a nice angle. So like we did before, we'll pull that through. Okay, we've got all the fuel lines connected. So let's add a little bit of fuel to the tank. Actually, we'll add a lot of fuel to the tank. Leave the cap off and see if we have any leaks. All right, everything primed up fine. So far, no leaks. Let's open the cap. And I don't see anything. So yeah, that was it. So I think it is safe to get this fully back together. And we'll bring it outside. We'll see how it does. So we started off pretty strong and made a few cuts with plenty of power, but then even at 2 turns out on that high speed needle, we started to run lean and the saw lost all its power and stalled out. So I would say the carb likely needs to be cleaned and rebuilt. You know, potentially we also have a crankcase leak. So let's get this back inside. We'll get the carb opened up and see what we're dealing with. Okay, so I got the carb pulled off the machine, and it looks like a fairly simple one. You know, the purge bulb is not part of the carb, so really we're just dealing with a couple of diaphragms down here, the fuel pump, and I'm thinking that's what the issue is, because those fuel lines rotted right off this machine, so the diaphragms might be in equally bad shape. You know, we got 2 good cuts and then it just acted like we ran out of fuel. So if those diaphragms are stiff, then, you know, that would kind of exhibit the symptoms that we're seeing here. It's not as bad, actually, as I was envisioning. The diaphragm isn't that crispy. And it does not appear to be ripped. So I don't think that was the issue. Let's take a look at the pump. A little bit of debris in there, but not terrible, not completely clogged. And this actually is kind of crispy. So I think this might be the problem. Yeah, so I'm going to run this through the ultrasonic real quick, and I do have a rebuild kit on the way. So when it gets here, we will put this back together with a fresh set of diaphragms, and I think or hope we'll be in business. Carb cleaned up pretty well. And we also have some new gaskets here. They are aftermarket, so I am going to stick with the original needle as well as the metering levers. I don't think those are in bad condition, and likely they're a better fit than the clone parts. And double check the height of the metering lever or lever. On this carb, it should be flush with the carb body. And we are pretty close. I am going to bend it up though just a touch. And let's double check that. Yeah, just a little bit more. So if this is off, this affects how much fuel the carb gets. You know, this is essentially the bowl. And if that lever is too low, then it's kind of the equivalent of running a bowl low on fuel, and it's still too low. Yeah, that's pretty much perfect right there. So that's going to go like that. And that one goes like that. So I'm thinking might be best to install it on this side first, because there are some alignment pins that hold everything in place. Okay. Okay, I'm going to get this bolted back on. Meet you outside for the test. That was a pretty big difference. This time around, it was hard to start, but that's because the carb was rebuilt, and I set the needles back to how they were. And like that, now the carb was running the engine way too rich. So I did end up having to back off that high-speed needle. We ended up just below a turn and a half out. And on the low-speed side, we're at just over 2 turns out. So like that, the saw seemed to be running pretty well and made quick work of this log this time around. Last time we only got 2 cuts in until the saw leaned up and ran out of fuel. And this time it showed no signs of letting up. So yeah, at the end of the day, this saw did not need a whole lot. The big thing was replacing the rotted lines and to a lesser extent, just repairing that carb. That's really all it needed. So all in, that was about $20 in supplies. And this is now a good running saw. So I hope this video helps someone. Thanks for watching.